morning or good evening, wherever you are. I will begin by thanking Tom and the organizer for inviting me to this great conference. And I'm very sorry that I can't be in San Diego like so many others, and I have to listen to many of the papers via Zoom, or sorry, via YouTube, and not all of them due to the time difference. But again, thank you for having me, inviting me. Canaan was an Egyptian province for the larger part of the Late Bronze Age. During the 13th century, the empire tightened its control over most of the region, and especially over the fertile and densely settled plains and valleys. The sparsely settled highlands were largely left out of direct Egyptian control, and some time after this new policy was initiated, dozens of tiny settlements were gradually established there. This wave of highland settlement was not only much larger than previous waves, with which it is often compared, but it also resulted in significantly different outcomes. Past waves of highland settlement were largely an expansion of the lowland settlement system, and were part of a mosaic of groups that existed throughout Canaan. The settlement system that was initiated in the 13th century, regardless of the settlers' origins, developed into a distinct identity group, defining itself in contrast to the Egyptian empire and its lowland collaborators, and maintaining sharp boundaries with them. This is the background for Israel ethnogenesis, and the emergence of this unique highland identity was largely a result of the deep involvement of the Egyptian empire in the region. In this lecture, I will argue that Egypt's special role in the formation of Israel can explain the significance of the various traditions about Egypt in the Exodus in the Bible, and can account for the role in the collective memory of the emerging new group. While the circumstances surrounding the Egyptian takeover of Canaan are not completely agreed upon, the broad outlines of its control are more straightforward, and it appears that the process was initiated in the 16th century. Egyptian control was most likely stabilized in the 15th century, however, at the time of Thutmose III. From this time onward, Canaan was an Egyptian province. Due to various geopolitical reasons, however, the empire focused its attention on the lower parts of the region, where the important roads passed, where the agricultural lands were located, and where the vast majority of the population lived. The sparsely settled highlands, although also under Egyptian hegemony, were apparently not given much attention. The Amarna letter provides a unique window into both the nature of Egyptian rule and the eternal situation in Canaan. While it is not clear how representative is this episode of Egyptian hegemony at large, the evidence suggests that Egypt's rule over the region was mostly indirect, that is, via various local kings which served as imperial clients. These kings ruled over their territories, pledged alliance and submission to Egypt, and paid tribute. Most of the client cities were located in the lowlands, and their territories were quite small. The highlands were only sparsely settled at the time, a point that is reflected in the text and is attested archaeologically. Both text and archaeology indicate that in addition to the large number of local clients, Egypt established a few bases in Canaan, for example in Beit She'an, Jaffa, and Gaza. These cities were under direct Egyptian control and served as garrisons. It appears that during the 13th and 12th centuries, the empire changed its policy, strengthened its control over Canaan, and especially the more densely settled and economically important lowlands and valleys, and moved to a more direct form of domination. This was expressed, for example, in the many governor residencies that were unearthed throughout large parts of the lowland, mostly in the south. Egyptian power was apparently shaken during the upheaval that accompanied the transition from the Late Bronze Age to the Iron One, but Egypt managed to hang to its power until some point after the middle of the 12th century. The tightened Egyptian control over the lower part of Canaan had some interesting consequences. The social fabric of late Bronze Age Canaan was complex and included various social classes and ethnic groups, as well as substantial fringe groups. From the Egyptian sources, we know of two broad categories of such fringe groups. The Apiru, that is, various social outcasts, refugees and fugitives of diverse origins who fled or ran away and formed groups. They are not limited to Canaan and are known from throughout the region during much of the second millennium BC. And the Shasu, described in semi-nomads, and as we just heard, are often compared to modern Bedouins, although this is debated. A number of such groups in Canaan and its vicinity are mentioned in the sources. Such groups are mobile and are therefore difficult to control. When pressed, they use their physical mobility and move away to avoid paying taxes or being conscripted for service. Furthermore, subtle manipulation of their identity makes them even more difficult to identify and hence to record and make accountable, and they can, for example, claim to belong to a group that was already taxed. Such groups attempt to cross boundaries and defy definitions. Mobility, therefore, both in terms of geography and of identity, is an integral part of the DNA of such fringe groups, enabling them flexibility and making it difficult to control them. States, therefore, have built-in distaste towards such groups and an interest in fixing them, both in space, that is, to settle them, and in identity, that is, to name them and fix their genealogies. As Waller noted regarding European imperial application of tribal categories to African societies, tribes as definable categories helped to make sense of the complex social terrain on which colonial rule was being erected. They placed people in relation to others and determined where they belonged and how they were organized, and thus how they might best be ruled and by whom. Organized empires have a better ability than most states to take care of such threats, and even more interest to do so. Empire, therefore, not only try to settle groups and fix them in space, but also to create rigid categories, force definitions, and name phenomena to better control their subordinates and make it harder for them, the subordinates, especially the fringe groups, to manipulate identities. Being a strong polity with a natural hostility towards such destabilizing factors, and from the Egyptian sources it is clear that this is how the Shasu and Apiru were viewed, the empire now pushed and bullied them, coercing them to cooperate and perhaps to settle or become mercenaries and the like. We have evidence, for example, of an Apiru group deported from Syria and settled in Nubia. It is likely that this attitude pushed many such groups away from the areas that were strongly monitored by the empire to, in this case, to the so-called free highlands. At this time, there was a wide spectrum of identities in Canaan, forming a sort of mosaic, including various Canaanite sedentary groups in the lowlands, various sedentary groups in the highlands, and semi-nomadic groups that were active in most regions before Egypt tightened its grip. However, strengthening the Egyptian control over the lowland, or what Shlomo Bunimovich called the shutting of the lowland frontier, pushed some of the fringe groups into the highlands. Whether coerced to migrate by the empire or fleeing, it is likely that many moved there, and they were probably gradually joined by others, including perhaps by some sedentary population that fled Egyptian exploitation, and apparently also a small exodus group, whatever was its nature. Many have indeed suggested that this is also part of the background for the settlement in the highlands at the time. The new settlers, along with the local Canaanites who already lived in the region, for example in places like Shechem, while coming from different sources and maintaining separate identities, gradually came to have something in common. This is the context for Israel's ethnogenesis, a situation in which a strong empire is interacting with fringe groups and bullying them is exactly the context that leads to the creation of new groups, or what is often called ethnogenesis, that is, the process by which new ethnic groups emerge. Such processes of ethnogenesis are often drastic, not only creating new groups, but significantly altering existing identity, and they often take place at the fringes of imperial control, as the great pressure exerted by the latter transforms existing groups, leading to the creation of new social formations. Hal, for example, stressed the social changes that were created in the periphery following its incorporation within a larger imperial system, and noted that weak imperial incorporation, and that's in contrast to full conquest and annexation, weak incorporation in areas that he called refuge or contact zones often leads to ethnogenesis. In such context, there is less direct political control and new formation can evolve. The issue was elaborated by Blanton, who referred to periphery incorporation in, quote, situation in which autonomous boundary or frontier zones are impacted by forces of economic and political change, unquote, adding, and I quote again, in refuge and contact zones, collective action at the local level emerges as a strategy for mutual defense and control of resources in socially chaotic environments plagued by demographic collapse, forced migration, social disruption, pressure from slavers, competition for resources. In such circumstances, groups of refugees from different cultural backgrounds and origins often overcome their differences and create larger groups with new identities. These groups will stress new practices, some of which are relatively more common and can cross traditional barrier between the previous groups. In this sense, ethnogenesis may be a strategy to manage an intensifying competition for valuable resources. This is because cooperation enabled better defense for member and better territorial control for the group at a time when their former social order was changing. This is an excellent description also of the situation in Canaan in the 13th century BC, which can perhaps be described as a shatter zone. It is thus the exceptional event in which an empire was deeply involved in the local affair of Canaan that created the above described changes. Later we will see that the change in the history of the country was even deeper than that. But first, let us examine the actual changes in the highlands of Canaan. The members of the groups that were pushed into the highlands and now formed a large percentage of its population had a shared experience and were clearly developing a strong feeling of what is often called we-ness. The similar pastoral groups that already lived in the highlands were easily drawn into this growing affinity, since the other is the most important feature in defining the we or us. It is almost inevitable that regardless of the existing relation between all these groups that now lived in the highland, which might have been even hostile sometimes, they developed a new shared feeling in relation to or against Egypt and the Canaanite city system that collaborated with it. This new identity did not replace the existing tribal or totemic identities of the various groups and was added on top of them. The limited sedentary population in the islands also maintained its separate identity, but in many contexts gradually became part of the larger highland identity that was created. And while on occasions it inevitably stressed its, for example, Shechemite identity, in other cases it was most likely happy to be included with its neighbors against real or fictive enemies elsewhere, like Egypt. Thus, in any interaction between members of these diverse highland groups and the Egyptian Empire or lowland Canaanite groups, and even those were even mentioned, the we-ness that combined the Highlanders was accentuated at the expense of their other identities. And since the shutting of the frontier must have been a defining event, it is likely that for a long time this winness was the most important collective identity in the island, even if not the only one. The Highlanders as a whole were now for the first time a counter-society or a counter-identity. They were probably not only cast away, but were probably treated as different and stigmatized by the empire and its collaborators, and were given names, probably derogatory. In such circumstances, the empire pays little attention to inner differentiation between groups and twists all the groups together, naming and stigmatizing them. This, however, often, very often, leads to the creation of those very identities, often with these names. But even when this is not the case, the presence of the empire and the hostilities involved inevitably led to the amalgamation of different groups and to the formation of a new identity. What was the actual overarching name of the Highlanders is not the central question here, but we must know that it is likely that it was Israel, and this is why Mer Deftach mentioned it as an ethnic group in his stela. What was the relation between the various identities? Was a new, broader, overarching identity the more important one, or were the local ones more significant? This was dependent on the context, of course. And when interacting with the Egyptian empire, the broader identity was activated. When no significant other was present, and the interaction in the highland was between various symmetrical local groups within the highlands, the local identities were more significant, and the larger ethnic identity, Israel, the identity that was shared by many of the Highlanders, was not stressed. As the Arab proverb goes, I against my brother, I and my brother against my cousin, I and my brother and my cousin against the world. Identity is dependent, or the identity that is stressed is dependent on the context. Given the differences between the Israelites in the Egyptian empire and the Canaanite society that dominated the lower regions, the Highlanders emphasized aspects of life that differentiated them from their other. And this is how many of ancient Israel's ethnic traits and behavior were selected. A number of scholars, myself included, have discussed these traits and behavior at some length, including the use of simple burials, antagonism toward temples and temple personnel, the avoidance of decoration and of imported pottery, and more, and I don't have time to go into it. Many of the above reveal an ethos of simplicity and egalitarianism that became a hallmark of the way the Israelite society perceived itself, in contrast to its others. In the first Exodus conference, I showed that many of these traits, including the above discussed ethos, were drawn from Shasu habitus, strengthening the widespread suggestion that this group formed the core of emerging Israel. Still, other groups joined in, including Chabiru, Apiru, local Canaanites, and even an Exodus group, whether associated with the Shasu or not. Before proceeding, I would like to demonstrate the importance of the Egyptian involvement. The extensive surveys conducted in the highland revealed that the area is characterized by severe settlement fluctuations, with previous settlement peaks, even if smaller, in the early Bronze Age and the Middle Bronze Age, followed by a decline in the Intermediate Bronze Age and the Late Bronze Age, respectively. Some have therefore noted that the Iron Age settlement wave should be viewed as just an additional stage in this cyclic process of settlement growth and decline. Still, the Iron I settlement wave was not only larger than previous waves, but also qualitatively different. Throughout the Bronze Age, the lowlands were the core and the highland were the fringe, suffering from these above-mentioned settlement fluctuations. The highlands were extensively settled only at times, and were always an extension of the lowland society. The Iron One settlers, whatever their origins, were no longer an extension of the lowland society and created for the first time a distinct society, defining themselves as different from those of the lowland. From now on, they went on their separate course, resulting in the creation of kingdoms in the highland, and even in the transformation of the region that was traditionally marginal into the core of future developments. Indeed, the settlement wave of the Iron One was not accompanied with a subsequent settlement decrease, but with a continued demographic increase in the Iron Two, reaching an unprecedented settlement peak in the 8th century, greatly surpassing all previous ones. Furthermore, in the Iron Two, the demographic and political centers of the region at large were located in the highlands, and from now on the highlands were often the core of settlement in the region, with large capital cities often exerting influence over other regions. If to use the Brodelian term, the Iron One settlement wave was an event that changed longue-durée structures. While many processes converge to create this result, here I would like to highlight one. And this is, again, the deep involvement for the first time of a real empire in Canaan's local affair. This led to unprecedented changes in the history of the region and to the breaking down of the long-term structure that characterized the land of Israel for millennia. The result was a disintegration of existing social formations and the creation of new identities. Ethnogenesis, as we have seen, common in the fringes of imperial control. It also made the rejection of the imperial control and its associated symbolism one of the defining features of the new Highland society, greatly stressing and probably existing negative view of hierarchy in what Scott called and I quote, state-repelling strategy, unquote. Many have pointed out that the long period of Egyptian rule over Canaan, and perhaps even vague memories of the Hyksos expulsion, helped the local adopt the Exodus theory. And there are many such stories, studies, of course. This is certainly true, but I think this is not the whole story and probably not even its most important component. Understanding, as I'm suggesting here, that the Egyptian empire was the anvil on which Israelite identity was forged, much better explain why the Exodus story resonated so well with all the groups that became Israel. The Egyptian empire was essential for the formation of the new highland identity. And for some time the Egyptians, real or imagined, were the ultimate others, those who were cursed anytime their name was even mentioned. This, I think, is a context for the antagonistic relations with Egypt that are reflected in some segments of the Bible. Not only memories of Hyksos expulsion of centuries earlier, and it's very difficult to see how such memories continue and can exert such a strong influence centuries later, and also not just the empire exploitative domination over Canaan in the late Bronze Age. And I think also not only the actual Exodus group that was experienced by some, but also the concrete confrontation with the Egyptian empire and its Canaanite allies, which pushed the group that settled in the highland to adopt which pushed the group that settled in the highland to do so, that is, to settle in the highland. This is what made Egypt and the Egypto-Canaanite systems of the lowland the archetypal others in the highlanders' collective memory. Whether there was an Exodus group that joined the Highlander, as most scholars think, and I think the evidence strongly suggests that there was such a group, or not, this background explains why the story was widely accepted. Egypt and its Canaanite allies were the first collective other of the diverse group that settled in the highland in the 13th and 12th centuries BCE. Hence, regardless of the timing in which the Exodus group arrived in the highland, and as far as the highlands are concerned, I think there is good reason to assume that the Exodus group wasn't Israel's core group, the story it brought with it resonated with all the settlers. When Egypt still ruled lowland Canaan, or even when memories of Egyptian rule were still fresh, and Egypt was a real immortal enemy, a story of a victory against this evil empire by a group that did flee from Egypt could have easily become a core story of the entire group. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Avi. We have time for one question. Does anyone have a question? Yeah, Deborah. Or is it Devorah? Sorry.
Deb. Avraham, I noticed in your slide that showed a bar graph of the rise and fall of sites in the Central Hill Country. I think it was only a couple of slides back. If you are able to show that, there we are. I noticed that matches up with Pierre de Merecheggi's diagram in his 2009 article about the similar thing, rise and fall of civilization, basically across the southern Levant. And in light of Professor Anati's talk and Tali Eriksson-Guinea's talk just before yours, I'd just like to draw attention to the fact that we have sort of, probably overstating it, but we have two collapses here. We have one in the Intermediate Bronze Age and one in the Late Bronze Age. And typically or commonly, we look to the Late Bronze Age for the exodus and then the revival of civilization in Canaan. But what if, and I know this is extremely controversial, but what if the collapse in the Intermediate Bronze Age is actually the exodus and conquest pattern there? So we'd have to shift the whole thing back.
Okay, thank you. First of all, the credit for this figure, for the graph itself, is to Israel Finkelstein, which I think, yeah, it's mentioned on the slide. This is where I took the graph from. Now, the graph represents the highlands. If you check other parts of the country, you'll have completely different results or different graphs or bars. So I don't think this is something that, you know, is like identical throughout the Levant. Again, when you're talking, and if I understood your question correctly, if we are trying to place the Exodus, and I heard the previous lectures and I read the articles that were mentioned many years ago by Cohen and others, and I will not go into discussing them, but I would just say that the evidence, and I think someone who asked a question after one of the previous lectures mentioned it, I think. But what I would say from my perspective, I can identify archaeologically, and obviously I'm not the first to do it, but I'm part of a large group, to identify the Israelite settlement in the highlands in the Iron One, or the 13th century onward. So if you would like to separate the question of the Exodus, that's one thing. But if you don't want to do it, I'll have difficulties not placing the Exodus at some point before or during, because as I said, the Exodus group is not necessarily the first group to settle, but again, at around the 13th or 12th centuries.